Welcome. You're listening to John Hyman from Commercial Real Estate Online. This is one of the many training videos that we put out for agents and brokers around the world to help them with activities, be it in sales, leasing or property management. This particular video is on property management and covers a particular topic which I'll move into very quickly, and that topic today will be asset planning. But before I do that, if you haven't visited us before, you can do so at our website, which is commercial-realestate-training.com. And at that website you'll get plenty of tips, tools and ideas similar to these, which covers many different issues and activities in the property market. So by all means check that out if you'd like some audio or templates or other ideas. That's commercial-realestate-training.com. So let's go back here and let's look at property management. That is the topic for this particular video today, and I'm going to cover asset planning and how that should be looked at from a property management perspective. So if you are managing a property, particularly a property with a number of tenants in occupancy, you do need to think about the asset plan, the plan that takes the property forward relative to the subsets of activity such as anchor tenants, capital expenditure, the actual expenditure in the property which isn't capital expenditure, of course the income, the leases in that property. You'll need to look at relocations, renovations, specialty tenants, the tenant mix itself, and also vacancy marketing. So asset planning is a very significant part of property management activity. And indeed, if you're managing a property with more than one or two tenants, you should really have a look at the asset plan process. Now, if you have a shopping centre with a number of tenants, then this becomes even more important. So let's look into some of these topics for you. The asset plan is split down into a number of specific issues. Now, the anchor tenants are the larger tenants in the property. The anchor tenants are there to draw people to the property, and in a shopping centre that would be a real and relevant issue. Of course, anchor tenants usually have a long-term lease, and that's something to be considered as far as how it has an impact on the overall property over the lease term. They may also have multiple options to consider, so it's not unusual to have an anchor tenant with, say, a 10-year lease or a 20-year lease, and perhaps one or more options of a similar length, and that could be 10 or 20 years. The anchor tenants have to be well chosen for their position in the property and their relevance to the customer base. And of course in retail property that's really important. So anchor tenants, they have a long-term lease. They usually have multiple options, and you need to get them involved in the property. And if you're looking at a shopping centre, for example, the anchor tenant should have a big role to play in drawing people towards that property, and around that you can then build the specialty tenants in the mix to take further advantage of the customers coming to that shopping centre. So let's go into the next subset of activity here, and that's capital expenditure. From an asset planning perspective, capital expenditure is the expenditure that needs to occur on the aspects of the property that are perhaps new or alterations, large alterations to the property. Of course, they are discretionary and sometimes they are essential. It could be a new cooling tower, it could be a new air conditioning plant. That's a capital type expenditure. And in that case, the works are so large that they do need to be timed. So the timing of the capital expenditure activity within the property budget needs to be considered. And that would also slot into the overall property strategy for the year. So capital expenditure is usually reserved for those very large items that are not repairs and maintenance related. So we go from that and let's go into the next topic, and that is ordinary expenditure. So that is like a repair and maintenance activity as opposed to capital expenditure, which I've just explained to you. So ordinary expenditure, yes, there are different categories to look at. Firstly, there'll be the controllable expenditure and the uncontrollable expenditure. Now, there's a difference here. Uncontrollable means that expenditure is going to happen whether you like it or not, and that is usually the expenditure that is attributable to rates and taxes, the council rates, the land tax, the water rates that apply to the property. That's uncontrollable expenditure. It comes in, it's got to be paid, the landlord has to pay it. So when you go beyond that, you then look at other aspects of expenditure, and they are more controllable. They are discretionary, they can be controlled within a budget through the year. Perhaps even insurance could be controllable in the sense that you do have choices when it comes to property insurance, and of course the amount of money that you may pay on that insurance and the timing of when that is paid. So that's how an expenditure issue becomes controllable, as opposed to uncontrollable, which would be rates and taxes paid at certain times of the year, regardless of any other activity in the property. So within expenditure, you should have a budget. Now the budget itself will be income and expenditure related so that you can achieve a net income understanding from that process. But the budget should be locked into the property prior to the end of May in each year so that it's ready to go for the upcoming financial year. And the budget should look at the aspects of the property involving rent being paid and expenditure being spent from that income that comes in. So ultimately you'll have a net income to consider. Now expenditure may be major and it may also be minor, and that needs to be considered in the cash flow for the building. Obviously if it's a major part of expenditure, it might be the painting of the property. Now that major expenditure could go on for some months and needs to be split in the expenditure budget across the property. So let's look at some other aspects here. Let's go into income. Now the income for the asset will fall into a number of different categories. And let's look at the easy one, that's gross rent. Gross rent is paid by the tenant. It would include any outgoings, etc. And it's one total sum of money that would be paid by the tenant to occupy the premises. Now gross rent is quite common in some property types, and the rent reviews that apply to the lease thereby calculate above that gross rental, and it might be a fixed percentage rent review of course, or it might be a fixed amount. So that's the gross rent. Now beyond gross rent you'll get net rents. Now net rents are designed for rent plus outgoings, as opposed to this one over here, which is all inclusive of outgoings. So that's the inclusive one, and this is the rent plus the outgoings. So if you have a property with a net rent, those outgoings will still need to be paid under the terms of each particular lease relative to the tenants in occupancy. And of course the outgoings that are paid need to be reconciled, and that is under the terms of each lease relative to each tenant. So you do need to read the leases. So that's gross rent and that is net rent. And the next one that falls in line here is the passing rent. Now passing rent is actually the rent that is being paid at the current point in time, and the passing rent will apply to each lease and each tenant. And when you take on a new property management, for example, you do need to look at the passing rent and understand exactly what it is, in accordance with the terms of the lease and the way in which the tenant is in occupation at the moment. So from that fact, you now move to a few other categories here. The first is the face rent. Now, a face rent will exist if incentives have been provided to the tenant. What this says is that if you do provide an incentive to the tenant, and there are a different number of incentives that can be provided, might be a discounted rent, a fit out contribution, or rent freeze. If the incentives apply, then you'll get the situation where a face rent is generated. And a face rent says that something was given to the tenant to get them to occupy the premises. In other words, they may not have occupied unless they received that incentive that they required. Alternatively, if there is no incentive, in other words, if that doesn't apply, then there'll be an effective rent. An effective rent is a rent that is paid from day one of occupancy, and there's no incentive to influence the tenant to occupancy. And if a property valuer is valuing an asset, then he will look for the effective rent or calculate one. If he sees that some incentives have been provided to a tenant to entice them into occupation, then he'll remove those incentives from the value of the property so he can get back to an effective rent. And that's how he will value the property. So that's income. So let's go down a bit further here and look at leases. Now, leases are quite important, of course, because they have an impact on the rental structure, the tenants in occupancy, the expenditure, the outgoings. The leases need to be interpreted individually by the property manager, and that is a lengthy job. And in a shopping centre with many tenants, it is a huge job. That being said, the property manager and the leasing manager really do need to be able to read leases quite effectively and directly. So there'll be certain lease standards that apply within each lease. They need to be checked. There'll be rental types, and I covered those rental types earlier for you, being gross and net, also the incentives. And of course there may be some guarantees or bonds that have been provided by the tenant to give some surety of occupancy in case they default. And within the leases again, there'll be certain documentation strategies that should be implemented when any new lease is in negotiation. So leases are really important from an occupancy perspective, and they really do need to be understood. So let's look at a couple of other issues here, and this one is relocations. If you're looking at a property and an asset plan for the first time, you need to understand within that asset plan whether you need to move tenants around, and relocation strategies would thereby apply. Those relocation strategies may be supported by lease terms and conditions, so you need to read the lease. That is the tenant's lease. And you would move tenants around if there's an advantage in the tenant mix in doing so. And the relocation provisions will be in the lease itself. Now let's have a look at another topic here, and that is renovations. Now renovations within a property will need to occur. A property over time will need some upgrades. And in a retail property, for example, that's quite common and usually will occur every 8 to 10 years. So renovation provisions need to be built into every lease for every tenant. So check out the leases to see if there are any renovation provisions to be implemented from time to time. Also be aware of the tenant and the customer usage in the property in case that puts special pressures on the tenancy itself, where that renovation provision has to be specially applied and calculated for the intense use of that tenant. Also within that property that you're creating the asset plan for, you may like to look at the common area, because certain tenants will put an extreme usage or demand factor onto the use of the common area. And for example, if you had a property that contained a call center, and that call center may operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and serve customers around the world. That being said, that call center and the employees within that call center are likely to put extreme pressure on the common areas within the property, that being the toilets, the entranceways, the doors, the stairs, the foyers, the lift areas, and that common area impact due to tenant usage will need to be considered. And of course there may be certain renovation provisions that you may apply to the tenant's lease because of that. And of course, as a property gets older, renovations should also occur for reasons associated with the age of the property. So that then applies to relocations and renovations. So I'll finish on that point today, and I won't go any further. There are other topics here to cover, and we'll do that in some other videos shortly. So that is the asset planning process. After renovations, of course, we're going to go into specialty tenants, the tenant mix, and the vacancy marketing. And there'll be subsets of information in each of these. For example, specialty tenants, there's plenty of things to talk about here. So let's go back to asset planning. Asset planning is part of property management. And of course today I was talking about certain aspects of that activity that you need to consider, and we got right through to renovations. So my name is John Hyman. I'm a commercial real estate coach. I produce these videos for agents and brokers around the world so that they can improve their market share, be it in sales, leasing or property management. And these videos appear on YouTube, and of course you can subscribe at YouTube for that very purpose. And if you need lots of tips and ideas, please visit the website, which is commercial-realestate-training.com. At the website you'll get plenty of ideas to use within your market today. And even today I put up a podcast, which is an audio program that can be listened to in MP3 format on any Android or iPhone. And of course you can subscribe to podcasts automatically for download. So my name is John Hyman. Thank you for joining us today. There'll be other videos, of course, in the property management stream, but we also have videos geared to leasing and also sales within the commercial real estate market. So I'll sign off for now, and we'll catch you again very soon. This is John Hyman signing off for now from commercial-realestate-training.com.